let's stay with the Buddha for a while, also forever, but that's a separate business. I was here, I think in the fall of 2022, and I'd agreed to do an event with a young writer I'd never met named Julian Agwan, although I'd read his book and liked it a great deal. But I was really grumpy about the fact that I had to fly back to San Francisco just because I'd committed to do this in-person event and was kind of telling City Lights books like, can't we do Zoom? Rawr, 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 grumpy me. It happens. And then I got there and I met Julian, who's a Chamorro person, indigenous to Guam, queer, and a climate lawyer with Blue Waters law firm. And as we got ready to start the event, Julian murmured in my ear, make sure we talk about beauty, joy, and abundance. And we were going to talk about, indigeneity and genocide and climate and the U.S. military in Guam and all kinds of serious things. And then I was like, I am so glad I am here. I am in exactly the right place. And we should all have someone murmuring to us at all times, or at some times, at intervals, make sure we talk about beauty, joy, and abundance. So I can't be Julian Agwan, but I'm going to see what I can do in talking about beauty, joy, and abundance. And I wanted to start with, originally I thought I'd talk about things that weren't in the room, but let's talk about what's in the room. We are surrounded by trees. If you're, I'm sitting on the stone floor, but most of you are sitting on a wood floor. All of us are under a beautiful Japanese wooden ceiling, which is sort of like a very elegant version of a New Mexico wood ceiling. There are wood pillars holding up this room, wood in the walls. We are essentially inside trees. This building is a forest, surrounded by trees all around us in all directions, including the native juniper pinon up in the hills around us. But also, Roshi told me that when she acquired this property, it was a bean field. Every tree here she planted, and they are all around us now, and some of them are quite tall. So I want us all to enter the forest. You on Zoom, you in the 1,000 rooms, I'm sure every one of you is not far from a tree as paper, a tree as wood, a tree as the chair you're sitting on, a tree as the kitchen table you're sitting at, a tree as what your house is made out of. I'm a San Franciscan. My building, which I share with some other households, was built before 1900. So the structural members are old growth redwood. And Mia Monroe, a park ranger at Muir Woods, once said to me, I love driving around San Francisco and seeing the old growth redwoods standing as houses. And so I just wanted us to feel this ubiquity of wood. I'm reading to you off wood. I just wiped my hands on wood, aka paper towels, a little while ago. How many of you had apples at breakfast? Ooh. So trees are inside you while you're inside trees in this room. We really forget how ubiquitous they are. And one thing I didn't really understand before I started doing climate is that plants made this world. In the beginning of life on Earth, when all life was in the oceans, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. It was a byproduct of photosynthesis from cyanobacteria. And trees are still emitting oxygen, but the about 20% oxygen we have, which is pretty ideal. Our planet's very adapted to that. The trees, we inhale the air and exhale carbon dioxide. The trees put out oxygen. And so we live in an atmosphere made by plants. Okay, cyanobacteria, a little on the borderline between plants and bacteria, but photosynthetic. And, there's all these charts you'll see about how many animals are wild and how it's dwarfed by all those damn cows and domestic animals and humans and stuff. But the animal kingdom is dwarfed by the plant kingdom. Plants run this world, and we're at war with them with climate change. But they're still doing this beautiful and amazing thing. There's debatable figures, but about 2/5 of the carbon dioxide we emit by burning fossil fuels is sequestered again by trees, which pull in the carbon dioxide from the air and fix it as carbon to make themselves, make their bodies, make, or put it underground as roots, etc. And so climate change is a war against trees. It's also taking what made this modern atmosphere, which is the carbon sequestration in the era called the Carboniferous, but I think our era should be there's this very kind of steamy, tropical, jungly era 300 million years ago, when a lot of the plants, and this is before flowering plants, this is before dinosaurs, this is before a lot of things, this is before modern continents, but the plants were doing what still happens in peat bogs and wetlands. When they died, they didn't burn, they didn't decay and go back into the atmosphere. They got sequestered. When we burn coal, so-called methane gas, so-called natural gas, or oil, we're burning the carbon that they put underground. And so there's a sense in which they made this world by putting a huge amount of carbon underground. And one of our mottos in the climate movement is keep it in the ground. And, we now recognize it as fossil fuels. So there's this beautiful system that trees represent, and they're ubiquitous. So when we think about beauty, abundance, and joy, I wanted to think about trees, the kind of scientific miracle of them, but also this ubiquity. And one of the wonderful things that just happened, apparently Roshi was like, this room needs about a 7-foot-tall Buddha, and the next day somebody called and offered her one. And this Buddha is from Burma. It is exactly what she ordered from the universe, which provided. It's almost certainly carved from a single tree. At least I can see no seam. So you can assume the tree was huge, this wide around. And so, when you look at it, it's so easy to look at things and not imagine what they're made out of, where they came from, how they got here, which is always a story about labor and materials, both of which always deserve our respect. So imagine a forest somewhere in Burma, in Buddhist Burma, probably before British colonialism, the cutting down of a tree, the carving of a tree. I don't know, perhaps it stood in a temple, this sort of elegant carving of all the folds out of wood to imitate cloth, all the traditional sort of representations in this. I wanted us to just see all the trees in the room and the ancientness. How old was this tree when it was cut down? How long ago was it that it was carved? Are we looking at 200 years, 500 years, 800 years of time? I often go to the word spaciousness. It's something I crave when I feel boxed in and cornered. And I often want it as physical space, just to be outside, to be on the coast, on a mountain, on the beach, in the desert. But I also think there's a kind of a imaginative spaciousness. And so beauty, joy, and abundance, as we prepare to face a lot of ugliness as genocide in Gaza, the genocide going on against the Rohingya in Burma, in Sudan, as the destruction of forests, the threats against the Amazon, and the Borneo rainforests, and the temperate forests, the terrible fires a lot of us have lived through in recent years. The trees still doing their work. So this is the part. Did it get darker over there? Bring the light back in. I don't mind our light. I'd rather people see the trees than and the slides get a little faded. So beauty, joy, and abundance. Oh no, I didn't mean the lights. I was like, am I missing windows on that side, or are there no windows on that side? Nope. Okay, I'm usually sitting over there looking out that one. And then people of Zoom, there's this wonderful wall of glass at the far end of the room where you can see mountains and forests, and you can't see it, but below there's a river. And Roshi and I can debate about what happens to empires and whether mountains and rivers are still mountains and rivers because climate change. But right now, mountain, river. So in Buddhism, we say we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha being the community. And I think one of the things to think about as we go to face the difficulties, and we take refuge because we're going to go back out there as bodhisattvas and face the difficulties, the ugliness, the violence. What do you take refuge in? And I think for a lot of us, trees invite that sense of deep time, that sense of peace, that sense of refuge. The artist Man Ray became a refugee returning to the United States when the Nazis took over Paris. And he talked about and he was from New York, going to California and seeing redwoods and sequoias for the first time and wishing he could become a tree. So this is a much less carefully assembled talk than the last two I gave, because all of this stuff was decided on in the last 36 hours, and I can only scribble so fast. But another part of taking refuge I wanted to talk about comes from a book I wrote called Orwell's Roses that began with trees with my best friend Sam, who's making a documentary about trees. And we were sitting in our living room, and maybe we should have the green tree, Noah. We were sitting in my living room talking about trees, and he was talking about trees planted by notable people. And I said, George Orwell planted fruit trees because he'd written this beautiful essay called A Good Word for the Vicar of Bray in 1946, which recounts the fruit trees and rose bushes he planted in 1936. And Sam got very excited, and we hopped on the internet to see if we could see if the fruit trees were still there. I was able to figure out where he lived exactly. But, all trees just look like green cotton balls on aerial views on Google Earth. So I was actually on book tour the beginning of November of 2017. And I went to the house and to the cottage, really. It was a cottage probably from the 16th or 17th century that would have housed peasants that Orwell moved to as a very poor young writer at the beginning of the life he wanted to live. He had been working, he'd done a lot of jobs he didn't like, and was working to become a writer, teaching himself to become a better and better writer, and had also fallen in love, proposed marriage, and everything was coming together. He rented this cottage. His wild anarchist aunt had been living in this tiny place, and that he thought he could afford. I think it was like 3 shillings and 6 pence or some crazy rent like that a week, and started a garden. He was a passionate gardener. So I knocked on the door of this cottage, and it was a very country experience. When I caught the cab at the train station 3 miles away, the cabbie knew the house exactly, and then when we got there, he said, "I'll just see if they're in." And the man who Sam had written to about the trees, who hadn't written back, Graham and he said, "Oh, there's Graham now. I'll introduce you." A very helpful cab driver. As a San Franciscan, I can say this is something a driverless car will never, ever do. There is no substitute for human contact. And so Graham was incredibly gracious. He invited me in. I met his wife, Dawn. It gradually emerged that the fruit trees Orwell had planted had all been cut down in the 1990s, but we went to visit Nigel next door, who remembered the trees. And then almost as an afterthought, after I had, of course, a cup of tea, they said, oh, but would you like to see his roses, which are still growing? And hell yeah, I would like to see his roses. And there was something about, there's no substitute. This is part of my war with Silicon Valley. There is no substitute for direct contact, whether it's with nature, art, another human being or living being. And as I looked at those roses, which rather miraculously were in bloom on a gray November day, which happened to be Day of the Dead, a very big deal in this, Latino part of the world. They were in bloom. And the whole thing, I'm prone to epiphanies, but it was a great epiphany. I'd been reading this essay, A Good Word for the Vicar of Bray, where he describes planting roses, but I realized I never thought hard enough about what does it mean that our great prophet of authoritarianism, fascism, totalitarianism, propaganda, and lies loved, planted roses and loved them so much, was such a passionate gardener. And I had read most of Orwell, but I hadn't read the biographies, but I had this vague sense of him as this very grim, austere figure. But I started to read his diaries and found somebody completely unexpected, a person who went and seized pleasure whenever he could, who loved animals, the countryside, rambling around in it, fishing, and particularly gardening. In one of those questionnaires writers get sent in 1940, he said, after my writing, the thing I care about most is gardening, particularly vegetable gardening. So, but roses are, and in a kind of grim Marxist way, you can justify vegetable gardening. He was very poor. It produces food. It produces quantifiable good in this way that any Marxist would accept, or any utilitarian. But what about the roses? George Orwell loved flowers immensely all through his life. And so part of why it was so exciting for me also, and this goes back to the person who got slammed for voting for Kamala Harris by somebody very judgy and censorious. A lot of you grew up in the right or the mainstream, and a lot of people who are in the left found the left a refuge from those places. I kind of grew up on the left, and it can be a little difficult and uncomfortable there, and unfriendly and judgy and uptight and censorious and rigid, and we have our authoritarians too, who know the one true way everyone should do everything. And one of the things that's so prevalent in the left, and it was in Orwell's time, it is in our time, is a kind of puritanical austerity, the sense that, I wrote in Hope in the Dark, this pile of trees. Another part of the Puritan legacy is the belief that no one should have joy and abundance until everyone does, a belief that's austere at one end in the deprivation it endorses, and fantastical in the other, since it awaits a universal utopia that will never arrive. Joy sneaks in anyhow, abundance cascades forth uninvited. And joy doesn't betray, but sustains activism. And when you face a politics that aspires to make you fearful, alienated, and isolated, joy is a fine initial act of insurrection. And so that's something I would say, is going to happen with the far right. They would be thrilled if we were miserable, terrified, defeated, kind of wringing our hands and felt deeply powerless. And I'm an ex-punk rocker. I was telling Roshi that I was able to segue very smoothly from punk rock black to Buddhist black. And, and I have a certain amount of, this might not be that Buddhist, a certain amount of fuck you still built into my personality. And Timothy Snyder and his 20 Principles for Surviving Authoritarianism, he published right after the 2016 election. The first and most important is do not obey prematurely which I always add, do not obey maturely either if you possibly can, but by which he means, don't anticipate what they're going to do. They're not going to let me say that, so I won't say that. They're not going to let me do that, so I won't do that. And I think, joy is inherently subversive. It is a moment of sort of self-forgetting, a moment of immediacy. I was mean to happiness yesterday because I think of happiness, the way it's described in this culture, as a kind of wall-to-wall carpet of the psyche. The idea that this sort of steady state that can't be interrupted by, the baby screaming or the car breaking down or the morning's news. Whereas I think joy flashes up at the wildest of times. I wasn't talking about happiness this morning when I was talking about disaster. I was talking about joy. And I think what Terry actually told us just a little while ago was a perfect disaster story. The world she and her neighbors lived in got torn apart, and so did their relationships to each other. And they built a kind of paradise built in hell when those divisions didn't matter anymore in the moment, and and the joy in the full absorption in the moment of watching what nature was doing. And I think there was a joy in the neighbors just really showing up and working together and figuring how to deal with what just happened without being all like, but I don't agree with you about 1974 and last week and the thing in Washington, D.C. So joy doesn't betray but sustains activism. And when you face a politics that aspires to make you fearful, alienated, and isolated, joy is a final act of insurrection. And then in Orwell's Roses I wrote, the left has never been short on people arguing that it is callous and immoral to enjoy oneself while others suffer, and somewhere others will always be suffering. It's a puritanical position implying what one has to offer them is one's own austerity or joylessness, rather than some practical contribution towards their liberation. I swear nobody in a desperate plight, in a famine in Africa, in a genocide, et cetera, is saying some affluent middle-class white person in America is very sulky on their sofa right now, and that is really fucking helpful. It is that, that is not, that grimness is not a real contribution. But it's often seen as solidarity. I found when I went out on the road with Hope in the Dark, which I wrote to counteract the despair when the war in Iraq started, the anti-war activists fell into despair because we hadn't stopped it. People felt the regime would last forever. I think Hurricane Katrina really took away its mandate. But when I went on the road, I felt sort of honor bound to be what Sam calls the Hope Lady and go on the road with the book after it was published for years. I found that it was people like me, comfortable middle-aged, middle-class white people, who really found that very idea of hope offensive and saw their despair as a form of solidarity. But people on the front lines are not despairing because for them, giving up means the children will die, they will always live under the dictator, they will become refugees who lose their homeland, etc. They persist. They may not feel hopeful in any cheerful sense, but they don't give up. And to give up on behalf of other people, which is what giving up on the climate struggle is, for example, is essentially to try and put living people in coffins. It's to break solidarity with them. And one of the most interesting times when I was on the road in those Bush years with Hope in the Dark, I talked to community college students, mostly immigrants, in Tacoma, Washington, and this very elegant and well-spoken woman, but with an accent, clearly an immigrant, spoke up and said maybe the most memorable response to the book. She said, of its overall theme, I think that this is correct, because if I had not hoped, I would not have struggled, and if I had not struggled, I would not have survived Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. And to hear from her, and to read about these moments of beauty, joy, and abundance in the midst of all that, one of the stories that's most important to me in here is, it's part about my Nevada test site activism, my friend B, who drew me in, but it's also about Primo Levi reciting Dante to a fellow prisoner in Auschwitz. And the way that this poem, written 700 years earlier, sustains them for a moment. Let me see if I can find it. I think I'm going to read this passage at... Okay, this book is 21. This book is old enough to drink, and I haven't looked at it in a little while. Okay, B, where are you hiding? But it quotes this passage by Borges, where he writes an essay about a leopard in a cage in the 13th century, and God says, I can just quote it from memory. God says to the leopard, despite everything, you will inspire a word in a poem, and that is your purpose and your meaning. And the poem is the Divine Comedy, which 700 years later, Primo Levi would recite in Auschwitz. And I'm just looking, because the stanza he recites, and he was an Italian chemist, and so, you know, I might have found it. One day in Auschwitz, the writer Primo Levi recited a canto of Dante's Inferno to a companion, and the poem about hell reached out from 600 years before to roll back Levi's despair and his, oh my gosh, might need to get the glasses out, and his dehumanization. It was the canto about Ulysses. And though it ends tragically, it contains the lines, "You were not made to live like animals, but to pursue virtue and know the world," which he recited and translated to the man walking with him. Levi lived and wrote marvelous books of his own, poetry after Auschwitz, in the most literal sense. In 1940, in his last letter to a friend before his death, the incomparable, uncategorizable German Jewish essayist and theorist Walter Benjamin wrote, "Every line we succeed in publishing today, no matter how uncertain the future to which we entrust it, is a victory wrenched from the powers of darkness." So Orwell loved literal beauty, but he also loved moral beauty. Our friend Dr. Keltner wrote a book about awe, and I really thought it was going to be about visual beauty, sublimity, kind of aesthetic experience, the kind of being overwhelmed in nature, or by music, but the first thing he talks about is moral beauty. And of course, the existence of moral beauty implies moral ugliness. And Orwell was deeply committed to moral beauty, and he walked his talk. He signed up to fight fascism in the Spanish Civil War, although he spent his whole adult life having terrible health, terrible lung problems, and would die in 1949 of tuberculosis. But he botanized even in the foxholes of the Spanish Civil War, where he almost died of a fascist bullet that missed his jugular vein by a fraction of an inch. So, beauty, joy, and abundance, as Julian instructed me, don't forget. So, underlying that leftist stuff is a grim utilitarian ideology in which pleasures and beauties are counter-revolutionary, bourgeois, decadent, indulgent, and the desire for them should be weeded out and scorned. Would-be revolutionaries often argue that only the quantifiable matters, and that human beings should be rational creatures, content with what should matter and fit into how things should be, rather than what does matter and how things are. And the fact is, we're more complicated than that. We're not utilitarian. We talk about the right to what used to be listed as food, clothing, and shelter. But something remarkable happened more than a century ago. And a woman on tour in southern Illinois to campaign for women getting the right to vote stayed in a house that didn't seem to have any men in it. It was farm women entirely, and she went and gave her speech. The women of the household, who were a bedridden old woman, her daughter, and the servant woman, who seemed like part of this trio of women. The daughter said, I already subscribed to the right to vote, so let the servant go. So she, I'm just calling her the servant because I don't remember if her name was given, so she can hear. And the next morning at breakfast, the 4 women are together, and the servant woman says, the part I liked especially was the part about bread and roses too. And that entered into the essay, which inspired a poem which became a famous labor song. I'm going to read to you, and somebody's laughing because they know what it is. Bread and roses. The roses in Bread and Roses constituted an argument not only for something more than those things I just mentioned, but for something more nuanced and elusive. As the labor activist Rose Schneiderman put it, the right to live, not simply exist. So I'm inspired by this woman campaigner in her magazine piece. He wrote a poem that appeared in the same magazine that is still, that Joan Baez and her sister Mimi Farina sang, that became Mimi Farina's Bread and Roses organization, that's become a slogan. And I spent my whole life knowing the slogan and not really understanding it. Anyway, the poem goes, as we go marching, marching, unnumbered women dead, go crying through our singing their ancient call for bread. Small art and love and beauty their drudging spirits knew. Yes, it is bread we fight for, but we fight for roses too. No more the drudge and idler tend that toil where one reposes, but a sharing of life's glories, bread and roses, bread and roses. Our lives shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies, bread and roses, bread and roses. That's about half of it. And what I love about it in this very simple way, it says, and it was taken up by these labor activists and these feminists, human beings are complicated. Yes, as labor rights activists, as class struggle people, as Marxists, as leftists, we want economic justice. We want everyone to have enough of the basic material needs of life, food, clothing, shelter. We would now add access to education, healthcare, etc. But it's an argument that human beings are more complex than that. We need beauty, joy, and abundance. And where you and I might need shelter, food, etc., in pretty much the same way, my beauty, joy, and abundance might be radically different than yours. And that human beings are mysterious, complex, highly varied. So it became shorthand for this beautiful argument about human nature, and argued that the things we need are also metaphysical. You could call them spiritual, you could call them aesthetic, you could call them ethical, you could call them, as I did last night, meaning, connection. And so I love that this more complex reality was articulated in such a relatable way. And, and it was also very relevant. And when I hold up Orwell as an example, I wrote a lot about him as a gardener because there's 7 main biographies of him. I'm at UC Berkeley, where I get my research books from. There's about maybe 6 linear feet of books on him. And, but everybody had kind of overlooked the gardening. And to me, it was moving seeing this man constantly go back to what sustained him, what encouraged him, what gave him his beauty, joy, and abundance, and then go back into the fray. And I'm not arguing for spending all your time in the garden, but I'm also not arguing for spending all your time in the struggle. And I picked Orwell in a sense because I see people like the poet Ross Gay, Adrienne Marie Brown, this sort of visionary, radical feminist, Black thinker alive now. There's a lot of people where I felt like if you talked about them living beauty, joy, abundance, bread, and also roses, they would be dismissed. And Orwell is the quintessential straight white male. Nobody was going to say but he was really a dilettante, a lightweight, etc. But it was really an adventure to look at him and look at how he thought through also what we get from these things. There's and I thought I'm going to just talk about these trees for a little bit because I put the pictures up and some of you are probably wondering. This is a bay tree that I suspect was growing on top of the hill near where I grew up in Northern California before California was stolen from Mexico, which never really owned it because it always belonged to indigenous people. This is Coast Miwok territory, and Coast Miwok people united with Pomo people to form the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria under the visionary leadership of the writer Greg Saris. They got federal recognition in 2000, and a few weeks ago I went to an extraordinary land back event with them because the world has changed so much. River Conservation Organization got a chance to buy a 600-acre ranch with endangered species, including a fish and a butterfly, an estuary opening onto the Pacific Ocean, and they bought it to give to the tribe for the tribe to manage, which is sort of how much our world has changed. That would have been unimaginable. So this tree, which is not on a path, it's quite hidden, which I joke is my real mother, has these huge, you can't see how big it is. Each of those arms is, about this big around. It's each of those arms would form a pretty substantial tree by itself. And like all trees, it is, a singular being, part of a community, and habitat for other things. You can see moss and lichen. I'm sure insects, birds, and other things are there. Bay trees produce nuts. And so next one, Noah. I just wanted just to have actual trees. So Sam and I did a road trip across from Santa Fe last year back to San Francisco. And we stopped at the Pando Forest, which some of you know about, some of you don't. It is 108 acres, I think. Maybe it's 106. 108 would make it more auspiciously Buddhist, but I think I must be scientific. I think it's 106 acres of aspens, which if you looked at them, just looks like another aspen forest. I've actually seen more glamorous aspen forests, but it's actually a single network that's been cloning itself continuously for 12,000 years, covering 106 acres. So we wandered around for a day in the largest and oldest known living thing. And that's something trees can do. And you'll read lots of stuff about how Pando is dying, but that's because deer in particular were nibbling the new shoots so that the forest wasn't regenerating. And now they're just putting fences that keep the deer out around chunks of it until the trees are 10 years old and they can sustain a little deer presence. And then the next one, and we went from Pando to the bristlecones in Great Basin National Park. And there's now some debate about what the oldest living thing is. Bristlecones live up to 5,000 years. There's trees in South America. There's creosote bushes in the Mojave that, like Pando, have regenerated themselves. But what was fascinating for me in this bristlecone forest is that the young trees look fairly straight. Over not just the centuries, but the millennia, they twist and turn. So I had another day of epiphanies where it felt like I was watching dancers and dances that took thousands of years to perform the kind of arabesques and curvettes and pirouettes. And maybe we should just go back to the Buddha. So Orwell had written in that essay that got me to go look for his trees and find his roses, one of those wonderful turning points I think is a bit like your brother, Valerie, saying, here's this newspaper article, you should go to Riverside Church. So, it's this wonderful meandering casual essay Orwell wrote when he was responsible for turning in a column a week for a left-wing magazine. And he wrote about a yew tree in a Berkshire churchyard, and then about the last king of Burma, whose supposed misdeeds he mentioned, along with the trees that king planted in Mandalay, which he called tamarind trees, which cast a pleasant shade until the Japanese incendiary bombs burnt them down in 1942. So Orwell actually began his life in an imperialist family. His father was an opium agent in India, where he was born. I always wonder if India will claim him as somebody born there. But then as a young man who didn't have the money to go to college, his family convinced him to join up with imperialism again. He spent 5 miserable years as a policeman, an imperial policeman in Burma, where this comes from, where he got to see imperialism up close and it turned him into an anti-imperialist. But in that essay, he wrote, "The planting of a tree, especially one of the long-living hardwood trees, is a gift you can make to posterity at almost no cost and with almost no trouble. And if the tree takes root, it will far outlive the visible effect of any of your other actions, good or evil," which I think is actually not true in Orwell's case. He's been quoted all the time now, but true in most of our cases. And then he mentions inexpensive roses and fruit trees he'd planted himself 10 years earlier, how he'd revisited them recently and beheld his own modest botanical contributions to posterity. So the trees in the garden were gone when I visited, but, and so that sent me to think about that and to think about this dying man fighting fascism, planting gardens, finding joy. He died of a tubercular hemorrhage. He drowned in his own blood, but he died with a fishing pole in his hospital room at University Hospital London, because he was hoping to be flown to a sanatorium in Switzerland and maybe get some fishing in. And there's a famous Buddhist parable. Some of you will know all too well. Some of you may not have heard, but I thought of it with him. It's about a person chased by a tiger who, running away from a tiger, trips and falls over a cliff. And as they're sliding down the cliff, grabs a plant that halts their fall. And it's a strawberry plant that's gradually becoming uprooted as they hang on to it, and clearly is going to give away soon. And it has one beautifully ripe strawberry dangling from it. What, asks the parable, is the right thing to do at that moment? And the answer is to savor the berry. To stories suggesting that we're always mortal, might die sooner than we think. There are usually tigers, there are sometimes strawberries. If you see one, enjoy it. Whether the strawberry is a story, a hug, an example of moral beauty, like, so we talked about bodhisattvas and the bodhisattva vow. I think there's a way people who get so committed to doing good can become embittered, exhausted, burned out. There's also something that relates to what I was talking about yesterday. If you face your enemy long enough, I think it's easy to mirror them. Chesterton had that thing where the soldier fights not because of who he faces, but who he's against before him, but because of who he defends behind him. And I think also going back to remember what you defend is a really important part of the work worth doing. And it's one of the things I loved about and Orwell was far from a perfect human being, very much of his time in terms of gender relations. He was not a super cool 2022 dude. Although a lot of the shitty beliefs he grew up, the anti-Semitism, the imperialism, the racism, etc., he really shed as he became a better person who thought more independently as he got older. But I think he also had something really important. Beauty, joy, and abundance show up over and over in 1984. I did not expect, and now I'm just seeing how the light is moving across the room. I thought I knew that book really well. I'd read it many times since I was a teenager. But what Winston Smith, the protagonist in it, does over and over is find a way to ground himself in immediate experience. One of the most compelling lines in that book is, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." We live in an age of disinformation with a reach and a power that Stalin and Stasi and the KGB, the CIA, all the agents of disinformation never dreamed of. And trusting your own senses, your own judgment, your own memory, trusting science, historians, understanding that forming that kind of fortress of self that can withstand being bombarded by lies, I think is also one of the jobs we do in this age. And Winston Smith keeps grounding himself in firsthand experience in the senses. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. Instructions like that you can always invert. Winston trusts the evidence of his eyes and ears. So I think that's also something we get in the forest of the tactile, the forest of the senses, along with beauty, joy, and abundance. And I've been going on a long time, and am I over time or at time, or do we have time to let anyone else talk?
We've been in trance, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. We've been in your luminous trance. Thank you, Rebecca.
You're welcome, Roshi. And, maybe at dinner time you'll tell each other what your beauty, joy, and abundance is, what you'll take refuge in, what you'll leave refuge to protect, how you'll manage those journeys between the two. Because I think, any of us who has agency, any of us who has taken that bodhisattva vow will want to go forth to try and liberate all beings, and will need to take refuge to not become embittered and burned out. And that's really what I was trying to convey in this wild ramble through the forest of ideas.
Rebecca.
So thank you all so much.
Rebecca, amazing. Thank you. So, dear friends, breathe in the dusk and let the fading light light you up. And then I just invite all of us to regather here at 5:30. Valerie will bring us into the grove, if you will, of her deep practice and our invitation to come to earth. Come to earth. Rebecca, thank you.
You're welcome.
May we all make rose gardens in the midst of this great aridity that seems pushing against us, and we can deparch our world. Thank you.
Fight for bread and roses too. I'm unmiked. Okay. Thank you.